Welcome to the Truth, Lies, and Consequences podcast, a space for thought-provoking and transparent conversations that explore the truth, lies, and consequences of real-life issues with the hope it inspires you to live your best life. Let's tune into today's episode. So, in today's episode, we would like to discuss vulnerability and what it is, what does it mean, the truth, the lie, the consequences of vulnerability for yourself. This topic was actually a suggestion from one of our listeners. So if you have suggestions, hey, folks, we'll definitely consider them as possible conversation. So just wanted to let you all know that. First of all, we want to at least give a definition of what vulnerability is. And according to dictionary.com, it's a willingness to show emotion and allow weakness to be seen or known. Also a risk of being hurt or attacked. And I would say that is a very good definition of vulnerability. Personally, I hate being vulnerable. That is one of these spaces I do not like to live. And it's not because it's such a bad thing. It's just the best way I can explain vulnerability in my mind is like getting on the scale naked and exposing my soul. And I don't like that feeling at all because it's so open. It's just wide, clean, open. And I have to kind of get comfortable with that for me to really deal with some truths and to get to the root of a situation that's causing me to be vulnerable. But I do know on the other side of that feeling that greater is coming from it. Like if I get real with myself and to really face whatever it is that's making me feel vulnerable, I'm definitely growing in that space. So even though I absolutely do not like vulnerability and I can physically even feel my body change when I'm like, oh God, I'm gonna have to get vulnerable right now. So I tend to like take a deep breath and kind of collect myself and like, okay, you can do this. Like have to coach myself up to get to that point. And then once I do it, I survive. I never, it hasn't killed me yet, but I just hate that feeling. But I know it's important to, allow personal growth. So Ebony, how do you feel vulnerability affects personal growth and why is it important?
So for me, it's important because it's part of my journey of self-awareness and it helps me to know who I am because I think the first part of self-awareness is knowing who you are. Mm-hmm. Knowing your strengths is important, but you also have to know where your weaknesses are and where your limitations are. And then you have to be in touch with your emotions. So all that fits into the vulnerability piece of it. And it helps you in regards to authenticity and being able to express yourself by sharing with others where your weaknesses are, where your emotions are. You have to be in touch with that for yourself before you can express it to other people. But then it also lends itself to being more confident. So if I know what I'm good at and I know what I'm not good at, then when somebody asks me to do something or makes a request of me, if I know what I'm good at and what I'm not good at, I can confidently say, yes, I can do that, or no, I can't do that, without being unsure of myself of whether or not maybe I could do that or maybe I couldn't do that.
You're right. I agree with you in the fact that you're saying how it's a level of authenticity that you have to bring to the table that helps us really get to vulnerability and how it can help us. So I completely agree. You're right. It's a matter of being 100 with yourself to get to that point. Here on Truth, Lies, and Consequences, we always like to break all the pieces down. So I would say in the spirit of conversation, the truth to vulnerability is that it's showing strength to be vulnerable. To let your guard down and to just bear it all and say what it is that you're really feeling on the inside. Because sometimes our emotions can be so raw that we don't even want to face them for ourselves. So being able to be vulnerable with yourself is a level of exposure that some people aren't even comfortable with. I know I have that issue. That's why I feel so much hesitation whenever I get to a place where I have to be vulnerable, because it's the complete opposite of having control to a degree. And I know for me, I have control issues. Charity, have control issues. So to be okay with vulnerability is to allow myself permission to not be in control, and that's okay. And being okay with not being okay in that space, and that to be vulnerable is a gift to myself, to be able to not be okay and not have control. And that's something I've struggled with just, growing up. As I've become older and wiser, I'm hoping that vulnerability is a space that I will eventually be comfortable in, but it's always a push and pull of the control versus the lack of control that vulnerability requires. So it is strength to be vulnerable. So I would say that's a truth to that. What would you say is a truth to vulnerability?
I agree. It is a strength to be vulnerable. There's a misconception that being strong all the time and having the appearance of strength is what makes you strong, and not being weak or admitting your weaknesses is what makes you strong. But you really have to think about it. To admit your weaknesses, you have to have a healthy self-esteem and healthy sense of self and a healthy sense of identity. So, or a better way to say it is, you have to start from a place of knowing you're enough, right? So if you think that you're less than, you're not going to want to look at your weaknesses. You're not going to want to look at the areas of opportunity, because you're going to feel even worse about yourself. So you have to be in a strong place of strong self-esteem and strong self-worth and strong self-value to even be able to tap into a place of, here's the places that I'm weak. But if you already know that you're enough, when you see the places that you're weak, you're going to look at those as opportunities. Like I said about self-awareness, you look at that as an opportunity for growth, versus if you're already thinking maybe negatively about yourself and not seeing yourself in the best light. When you see your weakness, is going to confirm for you maybe some of those negative things you already think about yourself.
Right.
So the key to vulnerability is first getting to a place of healthy or high self-esteem, and knowing that you are enough and that your weaknesses don't define who you are, because you're not what you do, right? You are who you are. Mm-hmm. And your weaknesses can change because you can fix them, you can work on them. So once you identify what they are, you can decide whether or not you want to work on them to make them better, or if you decide to keep it as it is, like, okay, this is an area that I'm not strong in, mm-hmm. so I'm not going to put effort into working on that. I've just accepted that as a weakness, and I think that's okay too. And an example of that would be from a perspective of strength. Like, I would love to be super strong. That's maybe a weakness that I have, but I'm not going to go out here trying to go to the gym and exercise all day, every day to become some sort of bodybuilder or something like that, right?
You're going to be caught Diesel.
That's a weakness I've decided to accept.
Same here.
So ultimately, I think weaknesses or vulnerability and being in touch with your weaknesses and your emotions is a reminder that we're all human and none of us are perfect. Yes. And every day is the intention and effort to just get a little bit better and to improve every day. And you can't really improve on something you're not aware of and you don't know about. So that to me is the truth of vulnerability is you have to start from a place of knowing that you're enough so that you can be strong enough to handle seeing some areas that you might want to work on and get better at.
That's good. You're right. It does open up spaces for you to learn where you can improve. And what is it going to take to improve in those areas of weakness, and to also embrace the places that you do have strengths. So it's kind of both sides of the coin in knowing that about yourself. So good. I'm glad. Yeah, that's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up. As we also still do here on the show, we're going to talk about the lies, honey. So a lie pertaining to vulnerability, I would say, is that to be vulnerable means you're weak, or that you're soft, or that you're too sensitive. That's another line that people like to say, oh, you're just being still sensitive. No, I'm not being sensitive. I'm actually showing a lot of strength right now. So bear with me, people. And it's a feeling, even though true, you may feel like you're not in control, or that you're very exposed in the space of being vulnerable, and that may feel like weakness to you because it's such a delicate place to be vulnerable, because it does take that level of really being in touch with your emotions. We tend to think of being emotional as a place of only softness, and I mean, unless it's like anger, those kind of emotions, we don't really convey that. But sometimes any sensitivity to a situation or a circumstance that's weakness, but it's really not, and that it takes a lot of strength to surrender to your feelings and to be in that sensitive place, because it can be so uncomfortable. So it's not weak to be vulnerable whatsoever. What's the lie you would say people would say pertaining to vulnerability?
For me, I think the lie about being vulnerable that I felt personally is just that it's easy. And it's very hard to be vulnerable, as you just mentioned before, because it's like standing on a scale. It's like there's no distractions. There's nothing to buffer. You have to look at it right in the face. You have to look at yourself in the face. You have to see things for what they are. You can't make believe and make up something different. And it also opens you up to judgment from others when you're vulnerable, and even judgment from yourself as well, right? So we're talking about first vulnerability within ourselves, and then later we can talk about vulnerability in relationships. But when you're vulnerable with yourself, one of the things that makes it not easy is because we often are very hard on ourselves. So as soon as we see some level of weakness and that we're not superwoman, we get down on ourselves. Like, why didn't I get that right? Why can't I do everything? Why can't I always get it right? And why do I have a weakness or a limitation? So that to me is one of the things that makes vulnerability hard, is just because of that self-judgment. And because of the pressure or expectation we put on ourselves to be perfect and to not have weaknesses. But it takes a lot of maturity and strength, like we were saying before, to admit your weaknesses. And also it takes patience and time to develop that muscle of being able to do so. So there's not an expectation that you go from not being aware to now all of a sudden you know what all your weaknesses are, or that you're not going to see more and more each and every day. You might see a different one or another one, the same way you might see more strengths that you have that you didn't know that you had. So it's just seeing it as a journey is something that helps to make it maybe a little easier, and being kinder to yourself and not being so judgmental to yourself, but definitely not believing the lie that it's easy to be vulnerable.
Yeah. Vulnerability is a hard pill to swallow sometimes. So you're right. It's not easy. That it takes a lot to just bear it all. So that's a good point.
All right. So we've talked about the truth. We've talked about the lie. So let's talk through the consequence of being vulnerable. One consequence, in my opinion, is the hurt and disappointment that could result from you being vulnerable. So like I was saying before, so you put yourself at risk of your vulnerabilities being exploited and also made fun of. Like, I think of someone who's not able to say a word correctly. Like, there's certain words that I wish I could think of one right now. And I'm sure that all this time I've done podcasts, there have been ones that I've said and you can't say it correctly. That might be a weakness that you might have. And people make fun of that. And then also too, with the exploiting of your weaknesses, like as an example for me, I learned the most about vulnerability as I was going through my divorce. And the reason I had to tap into being vulnerable was because I didn't want to repeat the cycle. I didn't want to end up in the same situation again, picking the wrong person again, like I did before. And I knew that there was something inside of me that made it possible for somebody to get into my life that wasn't the best person for me, that didn't add much value to my life. But I allowed that relationship to go all the way to the point of marriage and vowing my life to this person and pledging to do life with this person not being the right one for me. And after everything was over, knowing that I didn't, again, like I said, want to repeat the cycle, it was important for me, imperative to dig deep, introspectively look and think through what was the weakness that allowed that person to get in. And on that journey, I realized I had a weakness of seeking validation outside of myself. So I needed other people to validate me.
Wow. Okay.
And so, you know, if I have a thought and I think something's good and somebody came along and said, no, that's not great, I started doubting it. If somebody says, I think it's terrible, someone said, this is beautiful, this is great, then I'll go along with what they think. So that's essentially the examples of what that looks like to want or need validation outside of myself. So to the example of the consequence of that being exploited, when someone comes along and they're giving you and they're soothing that weakness or that wound of needing to be validated and they're filling that void for you, what that does is it blinds you to some of the red flags that I probably would have seen because that person was talking to my weakness. They were filling that void, like I said.
Gotcha.
And so a lot of the red flags I missed because that was one of the keys. Now, I'm sure there's others that I could definitely talk about as the journey I went through and looking at all of the weak points of how I got to that point of being in the relationship. But this is the one that kind of stood out. And that was one of the keys to my heart because you're telling me things that make you, you're beautiful, you're smart, you're this, you're that, and you're, why is nobody taking you off the market? Like, as they call it, gassing me up. I mean, not that it wasn't true. Like I am beautiful, I am smart and all that. It's just that when he came in and provided all of that validation for me, then that gave him access to my heart. And when you have access to my heart, then I see the best in you. So some of the red flags that people who don't have my heart or you don't have their heart will see I didn't see. So that was important for me to recognize that weakness. And that's, like I said, on that journey of vulnerability, I had to be vulnerable enough to recognize that. Back to the self-esteem thing, I had to make sure my self-esteem was in a healthy enough place where I could dig deep and see that, hey, this was a weakness that I had. And then from there began the work of building that muscle of self-validation, learning how to validate myself, learning how to make sure my inner voice was kind and speaking nicely to me and seeing my beauty and my value and my worth and correcting the self-talk. If it didn't speak to me in a way that was uplifting, then it's like, okay, well, we need to get some positive affirmations going, something else going on in my mind to make sure that the validation within myself was happening. So that shores up that weakness. So now instead of looking for the world to do that, instead of that being for sale where somebody can come along and do that for me and then get access to my heart. So that's one of the ways that I shore up that weakness not being exploited. So that's one of the benefits of vulnerability.
That was good. You broke that thing down, girl. So you the ministered over here. Go ahead, collection plate, pass. Go ahead and pass
so
it.
Silly.
Honey,
so silly.
Somebody need to hear that today. Because you're right, girl. If you can't be good for you all by yourself, if nobody go, I'm gonna go. So I'm so glad that, unfortunately, I hate how you had to come to that realization, but I'm so glad you had it because now it's crystal clear. You'll never be deceived again in that space. And that you now know what it takes for you to be in the best place for you to be. And even though how you got to that place wasn't necessarily the best way to go about it, I wouldn't wish that for you, hon. But I'm so glad you got that message out of that because that's a life lesson. That's something you will take to the end. And unfortunately, in our world now, we're so, not saying that validation isn't necessary. I believe it's a part of self-esteem, like you said. But if nobody can validate you, baby girl, do it yourself.
Right.
So that's it. And to be able to be vulnerable to go back and look at the circumstance, to understand, how do we get here and what was my part in it and how am I going to go forward and grow?
Right. Exactly.
Like I said, let the church say amen. It's done, honey. And I'm glad you were so open and transparent. I guess it's my turn. Vulnerability, like I said, it's not my favorite, but I know that being vulnerable allows me a safe place for myself to fall when I can't hold it together anymore. Because sometimes having a lot going on, I'm a daughter, I'm a wife, I'm a sister, I'm a friend. It's just a lot of plates that we got spinning all at the same time. And I want to be, my best version of all of those to everyone in my family because these are people I love. It's not like I'm doing it because, well, if I don't do it, they're not going to love me. No. I do it out of the fact that I love them. So sometimes being vulnerable to say, hey, I can't do this for you right now, or I need to take a break, or I need to just let some things go from time to time is a space where I have to learn and have to practice being more vulnerable and being okay with saying those things. Because if I don't, eventually not being vulnerable takes a toll on me where I feel like it's all compounding on me to a certain, and then that takes a toll on me physically and emotionally, and then I'm not in the best space, and then I can't act in love like I want to in doing these things or supporting and serving and loving the people who I care about. I definitely feel feel that by having a positive experience in being vulnerable, it gives me the space to do that and to say those things. And then by neglecting being vulnerable sometimes can be to my detriment. So definitely using vulnerability as a place to check in with myself so that I don't get out of control. So that's my consequence piece on vulnerability.
Yeah, I like that. It sounds like what you're saying is it helps you to have balance.
Yes,
in
very
your
much
life,
so.
Which is really important because when things get out of balance, that creates a lot of stress and pressure, and it affects health and well-being.
Yes.
So I like that a lot, that you're able to use that. Being in touch with yourself allows you to keep the balance. That's good.
Yeah, if I could think of it as a visual, because I'm a visual person, vulnerability is like a little closet that sometimes you just have to go in and get clear. And the only person in there is you and God. And sometimes you just have to lay it out in that closet and say what it is that's really going on in your heart and in your mind and in your soul, so that you can be your best version of yourself that you can be.
That's good. Thank you for listening to the Truth, Lies, and Consequences podcast. Please subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you're listening to, and you'll be notified of new episodes. Until next time, remember, the truth will set you free. A lie don't care who tell it, and no matter what you choose, consider the consequences.